When Michael started penning the Rhaenyra Revelations back in 2004, neither he nor I thought he would be where he is today. With the release of Drumendor, he now has 20 books spread across 4 series. Because he wrote all 6 of the Rhaenyra Revelations before publishing the first book, mostly because no one was interested in his stories, it allowed him to weave threads across the entire tale. What we, the readers, didn't know was that Michael lied to us about a great many things from the past, which he revealed through the Legends of the First Empire books. While Revelations was a great story, the existence of Legends opened up a whole new aspect to the world of Elan, and it just kept expanding from there. I'm Robin Sullivan, Michael's wife and helper bee, and this is Sullivan Spoils. Hello, and welcome to the second edition of Sullivan Spoils. I want to start off by addressing the elephant in the room, and that's the incredibly poor quality of my first attempt at this. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was doing it all at once, and hopefully going forward I'm going to split it up into smaller sections, and that might eliminate the plethora of ums and ahs that were so prevalent in the last episode. But before I get into what I'm going to speak about today, I do want to talk about a couple of things that we've updated on our blog. The first one relates to the Rhaenyra Chronicles hardcover. As some of you may know, we had a Kickstarter for that, and the Drumendor books have come in. Those are now available for purchase on our website. They will be available through the print stores on August 5th. But if you want to get yours early, you can buy directly from us. The Chronicles, books 1 through 4, were also part of that Kickstarter, and they are on the press now, and they're due to come off at the end of May. So depending on shipping time, we figure they should be to us kind of middle of July-ish, maybe early August at the latest. And if you want to order copies of that, I will put links in the show notes below so you can pre-order copies of that. Another thing that a number of people have been asking about is, will there be a version of Drumendor that will match the other copies of the Rhaenyra Chronicles? As most of you know, the Rhaenyra Chronicles were produced as a hybrid publishing project. The first 2 books were put out by Orbit. Books 3 through 5 were released by us. So when we put out our paperback editions, we matched the design of the Rhaenyra Chronicles that Orbit had done, which is basically a block of text and a picture. But they used characters on the covers, and I prefer landscapes, as does Michael. So we had Mark Simonetti do the landscapes for books 3 and 4, and he has now completed the landscape for book 5. So when it comes to paperback editions, there will be a version that will use that same design, and all 5 books will align so they all look the same. Now that won't be a while yet. Generally speaking, paperbacks come out a year to 15 months after the hardcover, and since the hardcover won't be releasing till August 5th, you're probably looking at late 2026 or early 2027 for those paperbacks. But I did want people to know that they are coming. Okay, so let's turn to Drumendor, the 5th book in the Rhaenyra Chronicles. Since you're here, I'm going to assume that you've read a lot of Michael's books, hopefully all of Michael's books, because there are spoilers for any of the books in these videos. And as you know, the first 2 books are an introduction to the pair. At the start of the Rhaenyra Revelations, Royce and Hadrian had been together for 10 years. I know there's some controversy over this because there were some places where we said 12 years and other places where we mentioned a different number of years. The reality is, the first place we mentioned how long they had been together, it was indeed 12 years, but that was done in Nifron Rising, and they had already been together for 2 years. So the real number is 10 years. Now, we have announced the release of Blythe Castle, which at this moment is the 6th Rhaenyra Chronicle book, which means there's potential for 4 more. But just because there were 10 years doesn't mean that there are 10 books, because at least one of the books, Blythe Castle, has to span over 2 years because of some important aspects of that plot. And that's what Michael is working on now. We think there could be as many as 8 books in the Rhaenyra Chronicles, but that will depend greatly on the cycle and how it comes out, because if there are other foundational works that Michael has to put into earlier works, then other chronicles will exist. But he is actively working on Blythe Castle right now. Okay, so from Chronicles' perspective, The first two are introductions, and they're meant to do the introduction to Royce and Hadrian and be a complete standalone tale that shows you how they met. When he started writing books 3 and then subsequently 4 and 5, that's when he had already written Legends of the First Empire, and he started revealing some of the lies that he had told in those first Rainier Revelations books. So what Michael did in the Death of Dulgath is he started to bring in some of the lore from the Legends of the First Empire. And this started intertwining the threads between the very old books in Legends and then the newer updated books in Rainier Revelations. It really is what laid the foundation for the cycle. And because he started doing that in books 3 and 4, of course, with book 5, he then had the Rise and Fall already written. So again, it allowed him to pull in more of these intertwining plot points. So Drumidor really is filled with a lot of intertwining plot points from both Legends and the Rise and the Fall books. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really special for me. So let's talk a little bit about what's a big emphasis of the Rainier Chronicle books. And that is showing how Royce and Hadrian became the friends that they eventually became. Long ago, Michael got a fan mail from someone that said, "It's very hard for me to believe that these two people could have ever been enemies because they have such strong bonds now." And that actually sparked Michael to write the Chronicles and to really dig in and show how they could be so different in the beginning. And then they could get the bonds of friendship that they eventually got. By the time we get to Drumidor, we're now at like year 5 of them being together. And so they are actually getting pretty tight. There's only another couple years before we hit the start of the Rainier Revelations, so they're much closer together than what they once were. And we'll see that a little bit when they're actually climbing the tower, and I'll discuss some of that when we get to that part of the book. Starting with the Legends of the First Empire, we start seeing other cultures, especially the elves, and starting in the second book, the dwarves. But it wasn't until Esarhaddon that we started to see the Balrog Gazelle and see particularly their culture from their eyes and realize that they're not such the barbarians that we know them to be in Revelations. So it was really interesting to me that when he started Drumidor, which is post both Rise and Fall and Legends of the First Empire, that we really got to see a very multicultural society and see humans, elves, and dwarves kind of interacting together and starting to see how the dwarves have been mistreated by humankind. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about related to Drumidor is its tone, because it's much different than the more recent books that Michael has been writing. In Legends of the First Empire, we saw a much more epic tale with very much higher stakes. Michael goes into the underworld. We start hearing about things like the Gull Rock, which of course is going to be a major emphasis of the cycle series. In the Rise and Fall, we start seeing a lot of heartaches in Michael's books. In Nolan, we see Sephron, who has to kill Nephron, and therefore she loses her soul. And of course, there's a lot of questions about what happened to her after that. I will say that I suspect that we will be seeing more about that in the cycle series. And then, of course, there's Fairlane, which has one of the saddest endings of all of Michael's books. A lot of people cry in that. A lot of people understand why it had to happen that way. But there's more than a few people who really don't like the fact that it was very anti-Michael to have a less than happily ever after. And then we get to Esarhaddon. And most people who come to Esarhaddon probably have already met him in Rainier Revelations, although many people read in chronological order, so they won't. But we end that book with the destruction of Persepolis, and although we don't know for sure what happened to Esarhaddon, for those who read Rainier Revelations, they do know that he is eventually captured and imprisoned. So not really happy times going on in the last couple of books. And then comes Drumidor. It returns us to Royce and Hadrian, which are always a good time to be with. And what Michael was doing with this book was fulfilling a requirement that I wanted, which is I wanted to bring the fun. I wanted it to be a happy book. I wanted it to be a fun book. I wanted it to be very rompy. I didn't want anything to be too serious and dire, although there is a lot of serious and dire towards the end of the books as we got going. But most of all, I just wanted to hang out with two of my favorite rogues for hire. I wanted to hang out with Royce and Hadrian. I wanted to spend a good time with them. So the beginning of the book is very different than the rest of Michael's books, because really what he's doing is he's just giving us some time with the pair. And that's actually some of the best things I like about the books. There are a lot of fan mails that we get that say, I would read any book with Michael. Royce and Hadrian could be going grocery shopping and I would read it. And I feel the same way. So it was really great to see them in a more relaxed situation, to see them while they were on vacation. And it was an aspect of the tone of the book that I really enjoyed. In the Rhaenyra Revelations, we don't see much about the supernatural in Michael's writing. Yes, there's Arista, and she knows magic, and she's starting to bring back the arts from the ancient times. But for the most part, it's pretty standard, non-occult, non-ghost, non-supernatural aspects to it. This starts to change with Hilfred during the rescuing of Arista in The Rose and the Thorn. A small mention where he is going out to get Arista, and as he's coming down the stairs, he's having a problem getting out of the castle, and he hears his mother's voice calling to him to get him out. It can be assumed that that is his mother in ghost form, that she's been watching him and trying to make sure that he has a good life and is staying on the right path. And so that's the first time we start seeing something supernatural. By the time we get to the death of Dulgath, we start seeing even more supernatural occurrences. For instance, the main character, Nissa Dulgath, we find out is an ancient soul. For those who've read Legends of the First Empire, you should notice that it is Macaretta, who had killed the Fane and lost her soul because of doing that, who has now come to Dulgath, started off in the body of Maddie Oldcorn, and then when Maddie died, she moved into the body of Nissa Dulgath. And by the time of the end of the book, that same soul has moved into the body of Lord Fawkes. And then, of course, when we get to Winter's Daughter, there's a lot more supernatural things going on. We see the ability to animate stone objects, golems and statues, and get them to fight. In some respects, that might be considered magic, but it also has a otherworldly aspect to it. By the time we get to Drumendor, we've seen a lot of supernatural occurrences. We see people who have inhabited dead bodies. We've seen people go into the underworld, into the afterlife, and then come back out the other side of it. We've even seen situations where there are creatures like the Rao who can extend their life on by killing other creatures and keeping their bones close on a pile. And in Drumendor, we see for the first time essentially a Walking Dead. That's because very early on in the book, Royce meets a character who he stabs in the throat, and there's no blood, which confuses Royce quite a bit. And as the story goes on, this creature keeps coming back, and ultimately is involved in the climax of the book. But I think that's the first time we've ever seen that type of supernatural occurrence within Michael's world. Now, when it comes to the Chronicles, it's pretty well known that my involvement in getting them created was pretty substantial. For those who don't know, when Michael finished the Rhaenyra Revelations, he thought he was done with Royce and Hadrian. He thought he was done with the world of Elan. He had exposed a very small part of a very large iceberg, but because he had no intention on publishing, he didn't think any of the stuff above the water would be seen, let alone the stuff below the water. So when I talked to Michael about what he'd be writing next, and I found out it wasn't going to be anything related to Royce and Hadrian, I got very sad. Now I consider myself a pretty good first reader, what's sometimes known as an alpha reader. And I also consider myself a pretty good structural editor in the respects that I can look at a story from a very high level and mention some tweaks that may need to be made to it in order to get it to flow the way it should be. But what I cannot do is I cannot create something from nothing. Back when Mike and I were younger, there was a very famous commercial that ran often, and it was by a company called BASF. And BASF never made any particular product, but they would augment products. And so their commercials were always something like, we're BASF, we don't make the paint, we make the paint brighter. Or, we are BASF, we don't make the recordings, we make the recordings sharper. And that's kind of what I see my role as, is a person who can take something that is good and make it better. But what I can't do is create something from nothing. So when Michael said he wasn't going to be writing any more of the Rhaenyra books, to me, it was like Royce and Hadrian had died, and I would never be seeing them again, because I do not have the mental capacity to create a story and spend time with Royce and Hadrian. It's just not something I can do. This was a little bit confusing to Michael, because he does it all the time. He's like, I can see them anytime I want to. I'm like, yes, and that's why you're a writer, and I'm the one who just helps to get the books out. So it was because of my depression, is the best way to describe it, that I wouldn't see them anymore, that Michael decided to write the Rhaenyra Chronicles in the first place. And the way it started out was way back in the day when the self-published books were being removed from publication and the Orbit books were going up for pre-sale. Michael had nothing available for sale at all. So he wrote a little short story on my request that gave an introduction to Royce and Hadrian. That way I could put it online, I could give it away for free, and he'd at least have something available that people could be reading while we were waiting for the Orbit books to be released. And that was a short story called The Viscount and the Witch. So when I said I wanted to see Royce and Hadrian again, Mike went back to that short story and he started to extend it. Well, he got about maybe halfway, maybe 3/4 of the way through that book, and then it occurred to him what a stupid thing he was doing, because he was showing the second year in the lives of Royce and Hadrian. Well, the obvious question is, how did they very first meet? What was their first occurrence? And so Mike stopped writing the Crown, the Rose and the Thorn, and went back and started writing the Crown Tower. And he wrote that book, then he finished off the Rose and the Thorn, and we submitted those books to Orbit. Now, there is one good thing that came out of the interactions with Orbit, and that was how the books of the Rhaenyra Revelation started. Originally, when Mike wrote the book, he started with the scene where Victor Lenanklin is waiting for the Marquis of Gloucester to arrive, and he's going to blackmail him with letters. So we start off seeing Victor and the Marquis, and they're talking about the letters, and they're talking about his daughter who was running around with Deacon Gaunt, and how she was going to be exposed in court, and it was going to be ruinous for their family. Well, that wasn't a great way to start off the book, because it did not start off with Royce and Hadrian. So when Michael redid the books for the Rhaenyra Revelations that Orbit would release, he dug up an old scene that had been written for Nifron Rising, where Arista, Hadrian, and Royce are riding to Aquesta, and they're set upon by thieves. So he took that work, put it into the beginning of Theft of Swords, and that now became the opening to how we get introduced to Royce and Hadrian. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about how this series came into being. But let's talk about Drumandoran specifically and how it began. Back in January of 2018, Michael was getting ready to start writing a new book, and I asked him what that might be. And just offhandedly, he said, well, considering what I've done so far, probably the next book in the Chronicle cycle will be Drumandor, because I alluded to what happened in that book, but I haven't told the full details of what's happened in that book. And I said, oh, cool, nice. And what he didn't know is I ran off to Goodreads, and I put a book up on Goodreads saying that the next Rhaenyra Chronicle book will be Drumandor. I do this ahead of time because Goodreads has a really nice feature where people who shelve the books, when the book is actually released, they will get a message saying a book that's on your shelf has recently been released. So it saves me from having to go around and telling everybody, oh, the book's here, go get it, go get it, go get it. So putting it out there as soon as it starts being made, it allows me to have a communication between the readers and Michael of where he is in the book. So on Goodreads, we use the review portion of Michael's books for him to keep track of what he's done and where it's going. And when I look here, it was January 9th, 2018. I said, created the Goodreads page. The title alone should be enough to let Rhaenyra Revelation fans know what is coming. If you've not read them, then I can tell you this book will have Royce, Hadrian, dwarves, and a very tall and very complicated tower. So that is when the book was announced to the world, and once it's announced to the world, Michael has to write it. So that was me ensuring that the book would get written. Now, people who know about the cycle will probably realize that there is no copy of the cycle on Goodreads. And there's a very good reason for that. Because if I posted a book on Goodreads telling you about the cycle, then it would mean it has to be written. And Michael does not want to do that. He does not want any books of the cycle to get out or be officially announced until he has the whole series done. So therefore, we don't have one of those. What we do have is the first book in the next series that follows the Rise and Fall, which is the Out of the Ashes book. This is book 1 of the After the Fall series. And Michael has been writing that book with a co-author. We're going to be rolling out this co-author over the next several weeks and months, so you can be introduced to this person and meet them and learn more about why it is that Michael is working with them in conjunction with this book. But that book does exist on Goodreads, and if you haven't already, I suggest, if you're a Goodreads user, that you put that on your shelf. I will put a link to that in the show notes so it makes it easy for you, and that way when that book comes out, you can read it. But anyways, so in January of 2018, the book came into existence from a conceptualization standpoint. In May of 2023, the first draft was done. In October of 2023, I started experimenting around with Royal Road. And so I started putting out some early copies of Drumendor on that site. And then in January 2024 is when we launched the Kickstarter. And then in March of 2025, the books finally arrived to us. And they've been shipping out from then. So far, we've shipped all the orders that have come in as part of the Kickstarter. And people are starting to pre-order the books from our website. We have shipped out just over 2,200 copies of it so far, so that's a really good start for a book. For those who prefer to buy their books from retail chains, they are available for pre-order now in all the chains. Again, I will post some links in the show notes for you to go and purchase from them. Or you can buy them directly from us. If you buy directly from us, they are signed. And also a much larger percentage of your money comes to us because there's no middlemen taking the vast majority of the profits. So that's another way to get a hold of them. So the book is now out there. The audio book has been out for quite some time. The ebook's been out there for quite some time. But for those who read paper, they have not. I have been getting some questions about paperback editions of the book. And there will be paperback editions. Generally, the hardcovers come out first, and then 15 to 18 months after the hardcovers, the paperbacks arrive. And we do have art from Mark Simonetti. So when those paperbacks come out, they will match with the other 4 books in the series. But the hardcovers are a completely different design. Again, because it's a hybrid publishing situation where Orbit owns the first 2 books in the series, the hardcovers and the deluxe hardcovers will not be available through the retail chain. The only way you can buy those is directly through us. And there's only... Hello, Loki. Here's Loki. You didn't get to see Loki in the last video. And here she is this time around. So the only way you can get those books are directly from us for Rhyea Chronicles 1 through 4. Okay. So with the background of the series and the background of the book clearly out of the way, let's start digging into the book itself. So a very interesting aspect about Drumendor is that Royce and Hadrian have actually been to this location before. It's one of those books where we already know what happened, so how can it be interesting to write? In many ways, excuse me, Loki. Tail out, thank you. In many ways, it's like Esarhaddon, because people who read Revelations know that Esarhaddon was responsible for destroying the Empire, and he was imprisoned, and later he was released and killed. So in some respects, when Mike was writing Esarhaddon, he's like, well, this story's already been written, everyone knows, so how can I make it interesting to the readers, because I'm basically treading tales that I have done before. And Drumendor is one of those cases. Now, the Drumendor in the Emerald Store and the Drumendor in the most recent book are very different places, simply because at the time, the visit to Drumendor was a very small part of the Emerald Storm. And so Michael didn't spend a lot of time creating the rich world that is Tur-Defer. Now, I really, really like the Drumendor setting in the book that has just come out. In the original book, The Emerald Storm, where they come to Drumendor, everything's covered very lightly. So we don't know much about the town. We don't know much about the time they spent in the town. We just know that they went there. We know there was a dwarf. We know that they learned from the dwarf how to enter the tower, and they and eventually that dwarf dies at the end of their encounter together. My cat is playing with a rock. Gravis Burling, he is a dwarf. He is a master engineer who's been working at Drumendor, and he gets fired. People who have read Legends of the First Empire may see Gravis's name and say, that seems very familiar to me. Where have I heard that before? And if you've read Legends, you have, because in the afterlife, there's a very famous dwarf called Andvari Burling, and he was one of the most skilled craftsmen that ever existed. And so we learn very quickly that Gravis is a direct descendant of the great Andvari Burling. Now, people might ask, when Michael wrote The Emerald Storm, where we first see Drumendor, and we hear that Royce and Hadrian took a job from someone named Gravis Burling, or Gravis, I'm sorry, there was no last name at that time. Did he know that that person was related to the Andvari of Legends of the First Empire? And the answer to that is no, because he didn't even know there was a Legends of the First Empire. He didn't know anything. He knew there were cultures. He knew there were various things that had happened in the past, those below the waterline, parts of his iceberg, but he didn't get into it in that much detail. But this is where we see first bit of interweaving between the older books and the newer ones. In Drumendor, he was able to do that. He was able to lower the water level a little bit, expose more of the iceberg, and more about the town that he only briefly mentioned in the Rhaegar Revelations. Now, if I had my wish, it would be for there to be a slightly different version of the Emerald Storm that has some of the flavor of Tur-Defer as it is in the 5th book of the Rhaegar Chronicles. I would like them to internally think about Oberon and the Blue Parrot, and maybe even Royce thinking about his first kiss, and all those little memories that didn't exist at the time that Emerald Storm was originally written, but could be referred back to. So I would like an even more intertwining between the books, and go back and revisit that. Will Michael ever do that for me? I have no idea. So once I announced that Drumendor was going to exist as far as the world was concerned, because it was on Goodreads, then Michael had to start writing the book. And one of the big things he was trying to do was to satisfy my need for a vacation, for some fun. And that's why, if you look at the first part of the book, it really is heavily involved in just hanging out with Royce and Hadrian while they're traveling to Tur-Defer and getting their hotel and settling in and going out to dinner and having some drinks. And it's a very slice of life, almost a cozy fantasy feel to it. And I adore that. I just adore spending times with them, because it's been so long since I've seen the pair. So that was very exciting. Okay, so we now have some history about how the series came into being, And when we started to make Drumendor be a book that was going to be written, now let's start digging into the story on a chapter-by-chapter basis. If you've read a lot of Michael's stories, you know most of them have two plot lines that go simultaneously. In the Crown Tower, you had Royce and Hadrian, and then you also had Gwen. And in the Rose and Thorn, you had Hilfred, and you had Royce and Hadrian. And then in Death of Dulgath, you had Sherwood Stowe and Royce and Hadrian. And then in Winter's Daughter, you had Jenny Winters and Royce and Hadrian. So the question is, who's going to be that second character in Drumendor? Well, in some respects, it's the setting as a whole. The place of Tour de Fur, the Towers of Drumendor in themselves are almost a character of their own. But the obvious person is, we're going to see a lot from Gravis Burling, and then we're also going to see some stuff from Gwen. So there you go, some background on the series and the book as a whole, and we're starting to dig into chapter 1, and in our next episode we'll start going through some of the other chapters and start talking about some of the interconnections between that book and this one. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Sullivan Spoils, and I'll be back soon with episode 3. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.